a special day because we have on the line a economist, and we have Molly Cheshire. And also I have joining me here in Rabbit Hole Central, I have Joe Cooper. So Joe, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
And I just want to mention that I met Joe through, actually I think through Howard Stern.
Correct.
Yeah, so.
Not directly, but through the show.
Through the show,
right.
Yeah. So I'm kind of excited because Joe is going to give more of
the every businessman's viewpoint.
Yeah, and
which is not necessarily an educated one, but a practical one.
And Robert, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
Robert's a professor at Syracuse, and you've been with teaching binary economics for decades now, right?
That's correct. That's right.
Great.
And you're very well qualified, apart from being a binary economist. Will you give a little bit of your qualifications?
Well, I have an undergraduate degree in physics and English, so I guess I'm supposed to speak English and have some scientific sense. I have a degree from Harvard Law School with honors. I have been in the practice of law, corporate finance, investment banking, and have been teaching for about 30 years now. I teach corporate law, corporate finance. I teach professional responsibility and a course in mergers and acquisitions, and also binary economics, which is
at Syracuse, right?
At Syracuse University.
Okay, I just thought that everybody should know how impeccably qualified you are.
Great.
Read all the great works in economics, starting from Adam Smith on. So I think I have a good understanding of economics.
So one thing I would like to do in this show is to finish up what Molly and you and I did last December when we were talking about capital ownership in corporations. And just towards the end, I felt there was a major shift with Molly because you were explaining how if more people had ownership in corporations, it would strengthen the corporations as opposed to some undeserving people coming in and having a part of the action. Molly, does that express how you were feeling then?
I mean, but it would seem that it would be people within the corporation owning part of the corporation. Is that what I'm thinking?
Well, that's certainly a part of it. That is to say, I think companies would certainly benefit if their employees had an ownership stake in the company, because I think the employees would work harder, they would give more of their all, they'd have a longer-term relationship with the corporation, probably be less pilferage, less sloughing off. There are some natural things. Lewis Kelso used to talk about the self-monitoring aspect of ownership. The owners are the people who really take care. So that stake would improve things. But that's not the essence of binary economics in the sense of what is wonderfully new about it. It is true that companies would benefit by having their employees have a stake in the company. Companies would benefit by having consumers. Their consumers have a stake. You fly an airline and you're on the frequent flyer program, or the Hertz, or the hotels. Companies now are trying to link consumers that can have a regular return relationship with a company. So the companies have that interest too. Companies actually have an interest in having their neighbors have an interest in the company. If you could imagine...
You mean their physical neighbors?
Their physical neighbors. If you could imagine companies that are in what you might call a company town, or a town of 20, 30, 50,000 people where there are companies there. To the extent that the neighbors of the company have a stake in the company, that would reduce arsonage and pilferage and vandalism. There'd be a natural tendency to have a stake in the company. So all of those things are natural. But when you look at it even more broadly, companies as a whole have an interest in having the American population, let's talk about American companies, having the American population having a greater earning capacity. Earning capacity is at the heart of a healthy economy. you know, with this current economic crisis, you can say, well, it was precipitated by the real estate bubble, or well, it was precipitated by the securitization situation, it was precipitated by fraud. There's all sorts of short-term deregulation. There are all sorts of things that precipitate the crisis. But the essence of the crisis, in its deepest form, and it was bubbling for many years. What we face today is that there's a crisis in confidence. The consumer doesn't have the present earning capacity and the future earning capacity, number one, to buy what companies can produce, and number two, to pay off their debt obligations. That is the essence of our current economic crisis. And we're trying to jumpstart it to sort of get to the point where eventually everything will be okay, but we're assuming that somewhere in the future there will be earning capacity to purchase what is produced. And that's the heart of the relationship that all American companies have with their consumers. We would all benefit from a consumer population that has enhanced earning capacity. It's not just spending capacity. It's not just government spending capacity. It's not just consumer credit capacity. It is earning capacity. Future earning capacity is at the healthy heart of a growing capitalist system, and that's the concern. And that's where broader ownership comes into play. And that is to say, the idea that we can distribute earning capacity not just with labor, but with capital ownership. The essence of binary economics is that there are two productive agents that do work. Labor does work, and capital, that is to say physical capital, land, machines, tools, structures, those things do work. Both do work. And a broad distribution of both labor earning capacity and capital earning capacity is what's necessary for economic recovery. So companies have a natural interest in broadening their ownership capacity. I
don't think it's a natural interest.
Well, Robert, can I say something here?
Yes.
Let's work under the stipulation that everything you say is true, and I happen to agree that everything that you say is true. Mm-hmm. But working under that assumption, yes, we do have, to a certain extent, true, it's a minor extent, capital ownership today in ESOPs, in 401ks, in IRAs, but I think you're talking about more than just that. And what my question is, since 2/3 of Americans work for small businesses and not for large corporations, how would you go about explaining to, let's say, a family of 4 people who own a business that maybe has a gross of $40 or $50 million a year, how it would benefit them, above and beyond the fact that their employees would own part of the corporation and be more productive, why they should give up part of the equity that they hold in the company to employees, and how it would benefit them financially in the long run in practical terms.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, it is a wonderful question, and I have to answer that question in part. It's sort of like when you ask for investment advice. There's no one-glove-fits-all answer. It very well may be that a small company is such that it shouldn't set up an ESOP for its employees. That in part depends upon their own outlook for their future and whether it makes economic sense in the particular case. So although ESOPs are the brainchild of Louis Kelso, most people don't know that. There are 8 million ESOPs, and there are about 8,000 ESOPs and about 8 million employees.
I read on today there are 11 million employees.
Yeah, 11 million.
Yeah.
Most people have no concept that Louis Kelso was the creator of this, and that there's a broader economic theory behind it. There is, if I can give a plug, there's an article called Binary Economics, the Theory That Gave Rise to ESOPs, and it's on a website called ssrn.com, and everybody should read that. But it's not
For maybe, let's say they have 50 or 80 employees.
It may well be that the best thing they can do is support the kind of macroeconomic plan that would enable the bigger companies to capitalize people, and that they would benefit from it not so much from directly sharing ownership with their employees, but by participating in a larger economy in which people had more consumer power. So,
businessmen
it's not necessarily true that every company should set up an employee.
I understand what you're saying, but businessmen seem to be very, very, and being a businessman myself, before I retired, are very, very, let's say, self-absorbed with their business. And as this particular credit problem we're having now and business cycle problem we're having now, everybody tends to look out for their own interest and not necessarily look out at the broader picture. As a small businessman, I'm talking about businessmen I know. We as small businessmen are more interested in how to grow our business, not how to make other companies grow their business in order to then have consumers make more money to buy more product, because that's just too far removed from their business model. They always look at everybody else as the competition, not something to help promote another corporation, but to help themselves. So you're right, maybe everybody shouldn't be an ESOP. The one drawback to ESOPs that I found, which is a practical one, is the employees have a tendency to invest too much money in their own company, and if something should go wrong, using the poster child for that, Enron, you're basically find yourself screwed, because
have a diversification.
That's exactly what I mean. But I'm talking about what you're saying is your model, as you explained it now, is dependent upon the employer deciding that he wants to do it for his employees. Now you're putting the person who may be a 2-person ownership, 5 persons, 10 persons, to say, gee whiz, guys, I own 25% of the company. I'm willing to settle for owning only 20% of the company. Most small businessmen don't think that way.
To be sure. And the only rational reason why you would want to own 20% of a company that you once owned 25% of the company is that the result down the road, reasonably foreseeable, is that you have a net gain, because 20% of a much larger company is better than 25% of a smaller.
You're absolutely. I happen to have dealt with one company called Marburn Stores, which is an ESOP, and all through this financial crisis, they've remained on very stable credit terms, mainly because their employee base has been around for years and knows the business very well. And one of the reasons that they stay is because they're in an ESOP, and they get the benefits of that when they retire.
Yes.
The problem with that is that most businessmen in small business don't think that way.
That's correct. And all I can say about that, again, my role is a role of an educator rather than, let's say, an advocate of a particular approach for everybody, is that one benefit of binary economics, when people come to understand it, is that it is a holistic understanding of the entire economy that allows people to not only understand their own short-term parochial interests, but how that relates to the broader picture. And if binary economics does no more than get people to think, number one, not only in a particularistic sense, but in a holistic sense, and not only in a short-term sense, but in a short-term sense and a long-term sense. When you expand your horizon to think holistically rather than particularistically, and long-term as well as short-term, you don't have to give up your short-term interests, but you simply are going to be able to decide more intelligently. And every business person, even though they...
How are you not going to give up your short-term interest?
Pardon me?
How are you not going to give up your short-term interest?
Well, because once you understand how your short-term interest fits into the longer-term flow, you're going to be able to decide more intelligently intelligently what is in your interest.
Okay.
So you don't have to give up the short term to also appreciate the long term. And that's, I mean, you might look at it from the point of view of you know, you've got a road that's 500 miles long. It sure helps to know, you know, where you're going to be 30 miles from now, but it sure also helps to know where you're going to be 60 miles from now, 90 miles from now.
I understand Molly's point, but the reason I use small business as the model, because the present situation in the country shows where in large corporations, as sadly Alan Greenspan learned way too late, more people are interested in their own particular greed than they are in preserving the corporate structure in which they are employed. Where in a small business situation where it's owned, let's say, by a group of people or a family, they look at the business as their life, as part of their being.
Yeah.
Therefore, the integrity of the business is more important to them than it would be in a large corporation where it is, let me get mine and let me get out before the house of cards falls.
Well, again, all that thinking of every person for himself in short term, all I can suggest about that is that you can still do that, but you're benefited by understanding of the bigger picture. And actually, people who think they're thinking only in the short term are in fact making decisions about the long term that they're fully unaware of, or maybe not fully aware of. Let me put it that way. And let me give you an example. Right now, we have a debate as to how to deal with economic recovery, and there's not a small business person that's not interested in that. There's not a large business, a big business person that's not. There's not an employee. There's nobody who's not interested in that big issue. So, what is the debate? The debate is between the Democrats, who want to emphasize government spending, which is a Keynesian solution to the big picture, versus the Republican notion that wants to give more tax cuts and to rely more on private spending and investment. And that's the debate. Now,
I would venture to say that neither one, both of them are missing the point. You know, you can't give tax benefits to people that aren't making any money, and you can't spend money that you don't have.
Well, I can agree with you, Molly, but my antecedent point is that Joe Cooper's businessman is, in fact, deciding a big picture issue, whether he or she knows it or not. And my only point is, and I teach this to my students, you know, the last thing you want from a lawyer is to buy into what the opposition says are your only alternatives.
True.
I teach my students, if somebody comes to you and says, you have two alternatives, your back should go up and say, wait a minute now. Don't tell me I only have two alternatives. There are other things you haven't thought of yet. You always want to break out of that. And right now, the television, the mainstream media, the politicians are saying we either have right-wing theory of private investment, tax cuts, or we have left-wing alternatives, government spending, and folks, that's the only alternative. And the first benefit of binary economics is that it teaches you a third alternative. And it exists as an alternative, and my point, again, going back to Joe's point, is that it may be that the businessman has only set on his own parochial interest, but in fact that person is deciding whether he's a Democrat or Republican, and he is deciding long-term issues, whether he or she knows it or not. So let's give them a new alternative. And just because I can't explain instantly why the issue of whether you should have an ESOP or not doesn't mean that there isn't a broad, longer-term issue that people should be interested in for their own self-interest. So that's why.
But I think that is the key for their own self-interest.
Yes.
You know, I think that, you know, if you can convince people that it's in their interest to at least understand this,
that's right.
then it takes it to a whole different level.
Well, that's what Robert's saying. He's explaining it, but he says he's not an advocate for it. So he's not really explaining it in the way that he's not looking at it as a marketing tool where someone would go out into the general public or into the general business community with graphs and charts that they would be unable to understand in their particular business, saying this is the way to go.
That's right. I'm I'm not an advocate of ESOPs, but I certainly am an advocate of understanding binary economics. It's the same sense that I'm an advocate of understanding Newtonian physics. If you want to get to the moon, you got to understand Newton's physics. If you want to get to an economy where we can profitably employ our capacity, then you better understand binary economics. That I'm an advocate for. And in all due respect, and if the patient listener or the TV viewer of this, we haven't yet said anything of why binary economics is special. All we've done is talk around the idea.
Okay, why is binary economics special?
So let me give you at least try to get the 5-minute super overview.
Okay,
of what,
if you can do it in 5 minutes, I will be.
Robert, I'm timing you.
I'm going to start my watch right now and see how well we do here in 5 minutes. I'm going to watch it go as we move. But the binary in binary economics says that both capital and labor does work. So think of hauling a sack a mile and being exhausted. Think of putting 10 sacks on a horse and going twice as far in half the time. Capital does work just the way labor does work. And then think of putting 10,000 sacks on a truck and doing 50,000 sack miles worth of work. First recognition is that since Adam Smith, we thought that capital, like land, machines, tools, and structures, made labor more productive. But the reality is that capital is doing ever more of the work. So that's the first thing you need to understand. That is to say, the process of growth is shifting the work from the human to the non-human, always having the nature do more and more of the work. Capital does more work than it did 100 years ago, and capital has the potential to distribute more income. And that in an industrial society, everybody needs to own capital if you're going to expect to distribute the earning capacity to purchase what's produced. So that's the first proposition. And then the second proposition you need to understand is that capital does, not only does capital do work that labor did, but capital does work that labor can never do. We can't fly, airplanes can fly. We can help airplanes fly. We can't lift people thousands of feet in the air the way elevators do. We can't even grow apples. That is to say, capital does tons of work that labor can't do. And capital works really largely without labor. And then the financial thing that capital can do is capital can buy itself on the promise of its future income. Mm-hmm. That is to say, you only invest in things that pay for themselves. And I know that Joe's running a company. You're never going to invest in something unless it pays for itself.
Absolutely.
And capital can distribute their earning capacity to purchase what's produced. So
and capital can also be used
of growth.
Robert, capital can also be used to get financing for other things as well.
That's right. So there is a right that every capitalist understands that most poor and working people do not understand. And that is the most important economic right that one has beyond the economic right to your own labor is the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. Not with the earnings of labor, with the earnings of capital. Most capital is acquired with the earnings of capital, not with the earnings of labor. So if you expect to be able to distribute capital income broadly, you can't rely upon requiring people to acquire capital with the earnings of labor. It has to be with the earnings of capital. In fact, the whole Cold War, almost all of the 20th century, was a struggle as to whether the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital would remain private, or whether the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital would be outlawed, which is the essence of communism. So ladies and gentlemen who are watching this, if you've never heard of the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital, I advise you that this is the most important economic right beyond the right to the property right in your labor. And that everybody needs to do that. And you need to write your congressman to say, stop just debating about left-wing and right-wing theory. Let's start dealing with my right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. Everybody listening to this should immediately recognize that if their congressmen and their senators aren't respecting that right, they're not doing what the American dream is all about. And that's a holistic notion, and it's not just for me or for you, it's for everybody. So that concept needs to be there. Once you recognize that the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital is an important right, then you look to the problem of our recession. It's fine to talk about small companies, and they do employ most of the people. 3,000 largest companies, they own about 90% of the functional capital in our society.
And what capital? Are you talking about financial capital?
No, I'm talking about real capital. And Molly, you make a very important point. Ladies and gentlemen who are watching this, there's a big difference between real capital, which is land, machines, tools, and structures, patents, trademarks, trade secrets. That's real capital. You put that on the left-hand side of the balance sheet. It's assets. And then the other thing, financial capital, which is like stocks and bonds. That's a claim on real capital. It's not real capital. It's the owner's claim. So in the same sentence, you will hear a Democrat, a Republican, or a newspaper person, or a TV person say capital, and they won't tell you which it is. Always ask yourself, wait a minute, do they mean real capital that does work like horses and trucks and patents and trademarks and trade secrets and land and apple trees, or do they mean financial capital? So no, I'm talking about real capital. America's 3,000 largest companies own about 90% of the real capital in our society. And that's the reality of it. Even though small companies employ more people, the bigger companies are more capital intensive. So, and almost all new capital is acquired with the earnings of capital. Now here's the huge paradox. Of our 3,000 largest companies, most of them could produce more of what they're producing at lower unit costs if only people had the money to buy. That is to say, our recession today is a function of inadequate earning capacity. And people have inadequate earning capacity because they cannot acquire capital with the earnings of capital.
Or the credit at this particular point in time to overextend themselves, or if they can't pay it back, to go out and make the purchases.
That's right. And people are awash in consumer credit, and they have no access to capital credit. You can every day I get solicited to have more consumer credit to enable me to buy what I cannot afford today.
Molly, you wanted to say
There's
something?
no opportunity to acquire. You know, businesses grow on capital credit. No company operates and grows without borrowing money.
I guess I want you to just to recap on how leveraging, is how these major corporations acquire capital with the earnings of capital.
Okay. Any major company, and if you want to put that diagram up there, Paula, you're certainly welcome to. Any company that acquires new capital uses three sources to acquire that new capital. One source is retained earnings. And if you look at the major companies, about 70% of new capital is acquired with retained earnings. Those are earnings. That's earnings after profits, after all the expenses, it's the profits that are plowed back into the system. Now that's acquiring capital with the earnings of capital, the past earnings of that company's capital. About 25% of the capital is acquired with borrowed money. So the company borrows money at an interest rate, and they invest in more capital acquisition, more machines, more tools, expanded inventory, all the things that would be more assets, because they believe that the earning capacity of that new capital is enough to pay all the operating expenses, retire the debt, and therefore pay for itself, and then become more assets free and clear that provide more of a return to the owners. So companies, very much like a mortgage, you borrow, you invest in a real asset, but the mortgage here would be like for an apartment building that goes off rents. So the rents of the capital, the rents of the machine, or the profits pay back the loan. You invest in things that pay for themselves and pay back the loan. And if you look at America's largest companies, about 25 to 30% of capital acquisition is done with borrowed money.
But basically, you're saying that those are not available to the consumer, and that's what the real issue is.
That kind of capital credit is not available to the consumers.
The magnitude.
They're available to the purpose of corporate finance is to enable a corporation to acquire an asset before it's earned the money to buy it. Now that's available to the company, and indirectly it's available to the shareholders. So if you look at these 3,000 largest companies that own 90% of the capital assets, capital buying and sell, more capital on the future earnings of capital, partly borrowed money, partly retained earnings. The distribution of the ownership of those corporations is that 1% of the people own 50% of that ownership. This is rough terms. 10% of the people own 90%. And that leaves 90% of the people scrambling for the remaining 10%, and most of those people have a negative net worth and are awash in growing consumer debt.
Robert,
that's why the economy is stalled out.
Robert, can I interject for a second? You're talking about, when you're talking about large corporations acquiring money through, let's say, bonds or lines of credits through banks.
Yes.
I come from a wholesale retail background, and what I have found, unfortunately, when we're talking about the short term and the long term, is many retailers during good times overextend themselves in their acquisition of credit, issuing bonds or getting credit from banks in order to build more stores. So at a certain point in time, when a recession hits, it's not the decline of business that does them in, but the servicing of the debt that does them in. Well, that some businesses really have a tendency, and you can see it even today. You take a look at Starbucks, which landed up closing up like 600 stores. And you look at some of the other places that are closing down large portions of their operation. And I would say a lot of it is not because of the business going down, which of course brings in less revenue, but because a lot of it was done with borrowed capital.
Well, look, I'd like to, first of all, I want to say yes and no.
Okay.
There is no doubt about the fact that human error in management can will enable a company to borrow under the assumption that the capital will pay for itself, but actually be wrong, and the capital will not pay for itself. See, if you borrow at 6%, which is not a bad interest rate in a decent economy, and you expect to make 9%, but you only make 3%, you're going to suffer for that. So there's no doubt about the fact that human error is a part of the problem.
It's just in my 37 years in the business.
In the same period of time that you made those decisions, if capital had bought itself for a broadening population rather than narrowing population, then the chances of that investment earning 3% rather than 9% would be lower.
It's
that is to say, the more broadly capital is acquired with the earnings of capital.
What exactly do you mean broadly acquired?
Well, I mean acquired by the 90% that right now earn only 10%, only 10% of the capital acquisition.
So you're saying that if Circuit City had a broader
ownership base, yes.
They wouldn't have gone broke?
Well, if Circuit City and all the other companies that are in the top 3,000. Here again, it does help here for a minute now to get schematic and get
the charts are up.
There is this second chart that we all had trouble with last time, but let's first of all imagine a 3,000 American companies, all of whom believe that the broader distribution of ownership, and the promise of broader ownership, capital buying itself, let's say, in a period of 5 to 7 years.
Robert, could I just ask you one question?
Yes.
When you're talking about capital ownership, are you talking about financial capital ownership or real capital ownership?
In a sense, I'm talking about both, but it's
because right now the average person can only get into the financial end of it through basically buying stocks or 401ks or IRAs, buying the financial instruments.
That is today.
Yes.
But with a binary world, that would not be true. Maybe
okay.
I mean, we've got two different directions to go at once. It may be that. Let me ask you. Let me give you a proposition, and then we'll get to your question. Just like Newton said, force equals mass times acceleration. It's a very simple, elegant proposition. The promise of broader broader ownership tomorrow carries with it the promise of broader consumer demand tomorrow. Can you buy that?
Yes.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. So the promise of broader ownership in the future means we have more incentive to invest in the present.
Yes, because rich people get to buy more.
We will get there. But so the promise of broader ownership in the future means the incentive to invest more in the present. So a decision today to borrow money at 5% carries with it a risk that in the future it may only earn 3%, and also carries with it the promise that it might earn 8%, right?
Correct.
Well, with broader ownership, it's more likely to earn 8% than 3%, right?
Absolutely.
So, companies, at least theoretically, have an interest, big companies, deal with the small companies, have at least have theoretically an interest to broaden their ownership.
Mm-hmm.
But because the promise of broader ownership in the future is the promise of more consumer demand in the future, so it will make present investment, it will strengthen the promise of present investments to pay for themselves in a competitive period of time. That's the principles of binary economics. So how can that be done? That's your question.
Correct.
Okay. Imagine America's 3,000 largest companies being able all together to decide, if they want to finance a portion of their ownership through a constituency trust. And this is like a super ESOP. Okay? And let's let it just be one big huge trust, but it doesn't have to be. It can be separate trusts. So that General Motors could say, well, we have capital acquisition plans of so much. And Ford would say the same thing, and Coca-Cola, and Pepsi, and all these companies have capital acquisition plans. Now, they could, if they recognize that broader ownership will increase their prospective profitability of their company in the future, and they all have unused capacity now. They all could produce more, if only if people meant to buy. Let's say that they all include...
Wait, I think that's really key, is that they all have unused capacity.
I say they do.
No, I mean, I would say that it's sort of a no-brainer, but I think that's sort of the tragedy of it, is that there's unused capacity, there are people that need these services. I mean, not just...
But they don't have the earning capacity.
Gluttonous, consumers. I mean, people actually need these services,
right.
and there's somehow a hiccup in the whole...
Robert, can I ask a question? On this broad trust to talk...
Yes, you may, but let me just get to Molly's proposition.
Okay, because I just want a definition of terms.
Molly, I have a simple, elegant answer for why America's 3,000 largest companies have huge and growing unused capacity. My answer is that 1% on 50% of the capital and 10% on 90%, so the earnings of capital cannot be distributed to the people who need to purchase it. That's the simple, elegant answer to your question. And we can get from 1% owning 50% to 1% owning 30%, and 10% instead of owning 90%, 10% owning 70% over time, and all of that will employ more capacity. And it can be done without taking anything away from anybody, and the rich may even be richer in the process. So
and I don't even think this is on just America. I think on a global scale.
Absolutely, it's global. If we increase the earning capacity of most people, which is $3 a day to $5 a day, we would solve our balance of payments problem. It operates totally globally. I don't mean now, Joe, to cut short your question.
No.
But that is why we have unused. The simple, elegant answer for why we have.
I agree with you 100% on that.
Why we have a recession is that 1% on 50% and 10% on 90%, right. And 90% are growing and awash in consumer debt and welfare dependence, and they can't acquire capital with the earnings of capital. This is very simple. This is actually a very simple idea.
So let me ask you this.
Now we'll wonder why Milton Friedman couldn't get it.
Let me ask you a definition of term. This super fund you're talking about that the 3,000 corporations would contribute part of their real capital to, or the value of.
That's the wrong word, but go ahead.
Then you can let me finish the question, and then you can correct me because I know I'm not phrasing it right. It sounds to me, it sounds to me, and I'm just, as a layman, it sounds to me almost like a super mutual fund.
It is a super mutual fund, but with certain characteristics. It is like it could be that, and one of the and again, when you point out the problem with an ESOP is diversification, you could mutualize all these ESOP companies and create mutual.
That's exactly it, because then you're spreading out the risk.
Portfolios. That's exactly right. The problem with ESOPs is that they're not super ESOPs, that they haven't been extended to cover not only employees, but consumers, neighbors, welfare recipients, the whole works. They all could be involved. But it's not, there's no giveaway in this. Imagine now, I don't know if Paula has the drawing up there, but that drawing, this is the how to do it part. And then we'll finally, Joe, get to your issue of the individual smaller companies. But
which drawing, Robert?
this is the 6-boxer.
Okay, the 6
Because
box.
I think we've got, at least conceptually, to the point where the promise of broader ownership in the future is the promise of more consumer income in the future, which makes more capital investment profitable in the present. That principle, we don't even need the second chart for once you got that principle.
Okay, great.
Now the how to do it.
Right. Okay, the 6 charts are up.
6 charts are up. Okay, the company on the top left is both a single creditworthy company and America's 3,000 largest creditworthy companies. It operates in an individual basis and in the totality. Okay? That company could acquire more capital with the earnings of capital by using its retained earnings, by borrowing money, and by selling stock. And if it sells stock primarily to people who can afford to, which are, again, 1 to 10% of the people. Okay. Now, instead of doing that, a lender could loan money to a trust, which is the bottom left drawing. Loan money to this trust. We'll explain why it would do that in a minute, but it could loan it to the trust. The trust could invest in stock of the company. The company now has the financial capital, the money, to make the investment in the real capital, which the company believes will pay for itself at a rate fast enough to enable the company to make contributions to the trust, to enable the trust to repay the lender. So it works in a sense like a mortgage. You borrow, you invest in company's capital, the capital pays for itself, the payment goes from the corporation through profits to the trust, back to the lender. And if you have, let's say, a 5 or a 7 year capital cost recovery period, within 5 or 7 years, the stock is paid for itself. It is now, the new profits after the payout are now distributed to the beneficiaries. Who are the beneficiaries? Employees of the companies, consumers of the companies, neighbors of the company, and even welfare recipients.
How would that be done?
Well, how it would be done would be, you imagine yourself as being the chief financial officer of this company. You would say we ought to devote some of our broader ownership, some of our capital acquisition to broadening ownership, since it's nice to have customers down the road that can afford our products. And so we'll capitalize our employees to this extent. We've got consumers that come to us.
Wait, but just say, now you're talking about charity, correct?
No, I'm not talking about charity.
I understand.
It is on the promise, it's on the belief that we have unused capacity, and the reason we have unused capacity is that our ownership base is too narrow. So in order for us to employ our unused capacity more profitably in the long term, after all, we're in this for the long term. This company is there. Companies exist in perpetuity.
Robert, I understand exactly what you're saying. I understand about loaning the money because the lender would be happy to loan the money because you're spreading the risk over 3,000 large companies. Where I understand you, but I lose you at a practical end. And the reason I'm going to tell you a joke that the comedian Louis Black says.
Okay.
When you talk about the companies giving back some of the returns to the neighbors and to the welfare, Louis Black explained the difference between Democrats and Republicans this way. A Democrat looks at a half glass full of water and says, there's a glass half full. A Republican looks at the same glass and says, "Who drank my water?" And the fact of the matter is, what you're saying to businessmen who in many cases, especially the richer ones, and I'm making a broad generalization based on anecdotal information, are Republicans by nature, to say to them, hey, why don't you give back some of your profit to the community, thereby making it possible for more people to buy buy stuff. They would say, that would be all very nice, but I have a bigger responsibility to my stockholders than I do to the broader community.
Now, first of all, you are absolutely correct in saying that that's the way people think. But it's also important to recognize what that argument has assumed.
Okay.
It has assumed that the amount of water in the glass does not increase with broadening ownership.
Yeah, but then Republicans just get a bigger glass.
The amount of water that the Republicans have in that glass is the amount of water that companies produce when 1% of the people own 50% of the capital, 10% own 90%, and 90% are being scrambled for the rest. If you buy the first part of our message, that growth is the work of capital, and the capital can buy itself on its future earnings, and that the promise of broader ownership in the future will make more investment profitable in the present, then the idea that it's the same amount of water is a false proposition.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about economics now, I'm talking about human nature.
Well, no, you're talking about an assumed set of facts.
Oh yeah, but that's human nature. Sometimes human beings make assumptions that are not necessarily economically true, but they work on those assumptions.
I think you're wrong to say it's human nature. It is human nature to think that the sun rises. But we have to get beyond that if we want to understand Newton's physics and how to get to the moon. It is not human nature. It is certainly the conventional wisdom.
Okay, I'll give you that. Okay, that's the conventional wisdom. Okay.
So if you were to get that person to say, they're taking my water, you say, well, wait a minute now, but the amount of water that America's 3,000 largest companies can put in that glass will greatly expand if you broaden ownership. Then the whole motif, the whole example is wiped out. That's why
let's say I'm a Republican and I'm on the fence. Can you prove to me with an example that's in existence right now of this in action?
No, I can't. But I can turn this around and say, can you give me a more elegant explanation of why we have vast and growing unused capacity, other than the one that I provided for you? That there's a principle that the promise of broader ownership in the future is the promise of broader spending in the future, which means that there's more incentive to invest in the present. These are just basic principles of business. You give me a better explanation for why we have unused capacity. My proof...
People aren't working hard enough.
Well, you can say that. You can say that. You can say that, and that is the assumption. That is the assumption of what you call right-wing economics. But I think it's like saying you're not working hard enough because you're not hauling as much as a horse does.
Mm-hmm. I happen to disagree with that because Americans work harder than anybody else in the world.
The problem is that people don't acquire capital with the earnings of capital. The problem is not that people are not working hard enough.
So, Robert, you think it's more of an educational situation?
That is their story.
Do you think it's more educational?
I'm just saying that I think that until you can provide a concrete example of this in action, I think it's going to be very difficult to convince people to do this. I mean, I think that the ESOPs are a place where it is in action in a very, I don't know, not a full-blown way, but at least you can show that.
Well, look at ESOPs are a mixed bag, and ESOPs do not involve, by and large, acquiring capital with the earnings of capital. They involve buying capital with the earnings of labor, and it's like asking people to compete with horses. But let me suggest.
But I think that at least that's a bridge point so that people can understand that what you're saying has some veracity.
No, I think I simply do not. And here Norm may have a different view. Norm Curlin will be on a later show. I don't believe her eyes to other obvious elements of proof is not going to get to the whole picture. I think the proof that concentrated ownership is the problem is that there's no more elegant explanation for why, no more simple, straightforward explanation for why we have huge unused capacity, other than the fact that people lack earning capacity. And they lack earning capacity because we're trying to distribute what is increasingly made through capital through wages. Can't be done. Can't be done. Impossible. You cannot expect the work of horses to be paid to the people who are leading them. So that my concrete example is that we have a recession.
So isn't this?
Well, that's not the kind of example I want. Well, I say fine.
Well, wait. Here's the question. Do you think that if we had binary, that there would be no more recession?
I think that the chance. I think as capital is as more and more capital is acquired with the earnings of capital to a broader base, you'll have a growing, sustainable earning capacity that is directly distributed through the private property system from what's producing the wealth.
Robert, are you saying that
we will have fewer business cycles, we will lower the amplitude of business cycles, and eventually we shouldn't have them.
Robert, I'm gonna make an assumption, not being a financial expert,
sure,
but this particular crisis that we're having now,
yes,
is not your. I would say, having gone through 4 or 5 recessions in my working career, is not the typical recession in the sense where there has been a capacity reached, therefore less labor was needed because the capacity had to be reached to fill demand, therefore people got to be laid off until demand capacity went down, and then you need more stuff made, and then the cycle continues, the up and down cycle of the mixed economy theory. But this recession was caused in large part by new financial paper being issued and people using very short-sighted and very, let's say, selfish goals in order to acquire wealth. Are you saying binary economics would have made it possible for people not to have their houses foreclosed and get into overhead in their debt because they would have had more earning capacity to begin with?
Yes, I am saying that, but first of all, let me tell you where I agree with you and where I disagree with you.
Okay.
And I'm a physicist, so I tend to look at the...
You're much more educated than I am, so
no, I wouldn't say that. I just have certain things that I have experienced. There's a concept of what's called a supersaturated solution. You can have a liquid that has various salt in it, but it's all floating around, and it gets more and more concentrated. And there's no crystallization; it doesn't settle down. And you can put a single crystal in there, and it all just it just precipitates.
Right.
I think it's clear that what precipitated this crisis was the securitization of mortgages and selling them and creating perverse incentives among those who were lenders could loan and then foist the rich off the risk off on the market. People could get premiums for selling. The incentives were sell more, get out of it, and so you had a perfect divorce of risk from return. And yes, that precipitated the mortgage crisis, which precipitated the crisis in lending. There's no doubt about, in my opinion, there's no doubt about the fact that the deregulatory philosophy and the steps taken by the Securities and Exchange Commission, which were unwise, you can point to what I call precipitating crisis
Correct.
aspects to this, and I buy into them completely. And it might be that if those things had not been allowed, that we might have been gone on for a while longer, maybe another 10 or 20 years. It doesn't matter. It may be true. But I think that there's a deeper phenomenon, and the deeper phenomenon has to do with something, first of all, you talked about. First of all, there was the real estate bubble, which preyed on two different things. It preyed on people with inadequate earning capacity, using their homes as piggy banks. on this, the assumption that the real estate market would keep on going up, and lenders lending on that assumption, figuring that we're not going to hold on to it, we're going to securitize it and send it on. So we've got that phenomenon. But why did we have a real estate bubble? We had a real estate bubble because the market began to tank early on in the dot-com collapse, getting out of that and going into real estate.
Absolutely.
Why do we have a dot bomb? A
dot-com? Yeah, because I was just going to ask something related to that.
And then why did we have the layoffs in the 90s and the 80s? And if you know, most of our growth in the 90s was just financial growth, because that is growth in financial companies. But I think the longer term issue is what faces us right now. All that time, how is it that consumers were able to continue buying what was produced increasingly by capital and less by labor, by this process of shifting work from the humans to the non-humans? It's because we were financing consumption with consumer debt, and we were financing government spending with foreign debt, buying our bonds. That's a problem in the distribution of earning capacity, which goes to the problem of the distribution and the ability to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. If this idea, which was first floated in 1958 in Kelso's book, The Capitalist Manifesto, if we had begun in capitalizing people in 1958, then the glass would not be just a glass, it'd be a 10-gallon tank.
Oh, you're absolutely
full of
right.
water.
You're absolutely right. If there was such a thing as a mutual fund, I'm just using mutual funds, in 1958, and you put $1,000 in it and never put another cent in it, you would have more than enough money to retire today.
Well, that's just dealing with the but that's not even dealing with the incremental growth that would come from enabling people in 1958 to begin acquiring capital with the earnings of capital, so that this increasing capacity to produce more, and the father or the mother of that, of course, is technological advance. The reason we can always produce more and more is also technological. But the technology is reflected in capital instruments, and capital instruments will earn more if the ownership of that capital instrument is broadly distributed. So, yes, it's true that by compounding the interest and just watching what happens to the markets, you'd have that. But I'm talking about a growth that is even far bigger than that. We have a huge growth capacity. And by the way, growth doesn't necessarily mean more trinkets. Growth can mean bluer skies and environmentally sound ways of producing things that people can afford. When you talk about unused capacity, which to me is one of the huge elephants in the room, is that unused capacity is the capacity to produce things in a technologically green way that people cannot afford. There's hundreds of things on the drawing board. So growth is green, environments and lush rainforests and surviving species. It's not just more trinkets. And all that is the result of concentrating the capital acquisition with the earnings of capital. It's a simple, the sun does not rise. The earth goes around the sun.
That's absolutely
It's a very
correct.
simple theory. It's not a complicated theory.
So,
And business people need to understand it.
So, Robert, do you think the major problem right now, because the theory sounds good, it could possibly work, but in my limited experience in academia, your theory of binary economics is not widely taught.
No, it is not.
And so it seems to be and I know you're only an advocate, a marketing problem to a certain extent.
Well, yes, it is. Yes, I think it is a marketing problem, but that's one of the reasons why Paula and Molly and other people are doing important work, and you're doing important work. I look at it also from another point of view, and that is, I think that this idea, one might ask, if this idea is so good, why is it kept? Why is it not caught on if it's not so good? I have a proposition for you. It never enters the discussion, because if it ever does, it's so potent that it will be a huge international, global game changer.
Yeah, it's a threat. Like anything that's innovative, at some point in time, no matter what it is, even if it's new technology, it's a threat to the old technology.
So it might very well be. You see, the interesting thing is that we talked about these companies.
I'm afraid we have only 1 minute left, so perhaps for the future we can consider, if this is such a good idea, why isn't it being used? Molly, do you have some comment on that?
Well, I think that it is a marketing issue. It sounds like communism, and I think that people sort of shy away from it. It sort of.
I wish you hadn't used the C word, because communism is against private property, and I think that should be. It's the opposite of communism.
Like when you talk about broader share of capital ownership, that means that the people that have the money don't want to let go of control of it, and they think that by hanging on to it, they're going to get more. Where they don't realize that there is another way. So it's in sort of a difficult place.
Okay, well, I'm just going to end this and say thank you for joining me. This is Paula Gloria. This has been an excursion farther down the rabbit hole with Robert Ashford. Robert, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And I think we're going to do some more work about, I guess, hypnotic suggestion and mind control, because I think communism is misunderstood. And even with the Henry George work, I'm looking at his book, and it seems as though when people were looking back, they said it really is too bad even Karl Marx missed something very important about the importance of ownership. Would you say taking care of things, Joe,
yes,
is important?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's what we've been fighting for, this 20th century, and now we're in the 21st century.
Yes.
Is that fair enough, Aunt Molly?